What makes Napoleon a successful military commander to the likes of Alexander the Great and Genghis Khan? His near-perfect record on the battlefield. He won 90% of the battles he participated in, and his soldiers followed him blindly in the stakes where their lives were the wager. Of course, a general is only as good as his army. But what was life like living under the command of arguably one of the most charming, direct, inspiring, and ambitious military commanders of all time? Welcome to Nutty History. Today we're exploring life under the command of Napoleon Bonaparte and what it was like to be part of the most successful French army. The worshippers of Napoleon. It is not far-fetched to say that Napoleon's men treated him like some sort of higher power the way they venerated him. But that doesn't mean Napoleon Bonaparte reinvented the wheel of warfare. He was just really good at it. His focus, tenacity, and fervor for establishing France as the superpower of the 19th century was unmatched, and he was riding high on the waves of a revolution that had redefined patriotism in his day and age. Prior to the revolution, the French army was commanded by nobles and aristocrats who became majors, captains, and generals on the basis of being born to a certain set of parents. Talk about a plug. In Napoleon's French army, officers earned their posts by rising through the ranks on merit and heroics on the battlefield to fill 97% vacancies that were created after the French Revolution. As Napoleon rewarded every soldier who showed bravery, skill, and presence of mind in the battles, this made soldiers yearn for his respect and notice. His hands-on approach was the reason every soldier in his army felt special, and in return, they found Napoleon special. It wasn't only about deserved promotions. In fact, Napoleon's micromanagement and reasoning for selecting the top brass became the biggest reason for his eventual downfall. But to learn what was the flaw and how it caused the fall of Napoleon at Waterloo, you'll have to keep guessing and watching. Once during a routine inspection, Napoleon asked the inspection general to point out the bravest man in the army. The soldier chosen by the officer was called forward, and Napoleon took the Legion of Honor medal off his own coat and pinned it on the soldier. Can you imagine what a grand gesture that would have been for these soldiers who came from peasants' homes, and one of them just got the highest honor by the man who was possibly his own hero? At the Battle of Arcole in 1796, during the Italian campaign, the French Army Division, called the Army of Italy, I know it's confusing as heck, but anyway, they were facing heavy bombardment from the Austrian troops that had made crossing an important bridge near impossible. Napoleon famously grabbed the tricolor flag of France, walked in front of his soldiers with his sword in his other hand, and goaded them into a charge. He yelled at them, "Soldiers, remember you carry on your breast the name of the French Republic," and he dashed towards the firing cannons. The soldiers felt a surge of adrenaline watching their commanding general show so much bravado, and they followed him quickly, which led to a glorious victory. His words were often enough to rile his soldiers up in the name of France, but he also never shied from taking the first step to show his troops that anything could be achieved. He told them that if he could rise through the ranks of the army to become their supreme leader, so can they. Also, like Alexander of Macedonia, he often ate, slept, and endured hardships with his troops in camps. Oh, I could only imagine being best buds with Mr. Napoleon. Paid vacations? During the Egyptian campaign, the French troops began to feel homesick, so he ordered full-grown palm trees to be planted around their camp so that the environment had a Mediterranean feel about it. His mission to send scholars to explore ancient Egyptian history was also partially encouraged by his need to provide his soldiers entertainment, so that they may have places to visit and things to look at and stories to share around the fire at the camp. For a continent full of regents who never participated in battles, Napoleon was ruling like a common man for these soldiers. This is why they blindly followed his cause into bloodshed and carnage time after time. It's not wrong to say that the French was pretty much a cult or a sect worshiping Napoleon. By the spring of 1812, Napoleon's charisma had amassed a mighty army of 600,000 men from every corner of his empire. Not just French, but German, Polish, and Italians were also willing to follow him to kingdom come. The worst equipment. Despite getting a tutorial in Egypt about how not to mess with the water requirements of the army, Napoleon didn't learn his lesson. A year later, after reaching Cairo, the Grand Armée was asked to do a 10-day-long foolhardy march to Syria without enough food or water. You know, David Goggins style. The water they had was also of questionable quality. The sergeant mentioned that not only was the water hot and rank, but it was as dirty as if the goatskin was filled at the cobbler's tub where the goatskins were manufactured. Speaking of cobblers, the shoes distributed by the Army were made of turned cowhide and weighed 611 grams each. They came in 3 sizes only, and soldiers often had to march long distances in shoes that were floppily large or uncomfortably tight. And if that doesn't make you squirm, here's more. The shoes were not designed separately for left or right feet, but all of them were of the same shape with square toes that would bite into your toe tips with each grueling step. Ouch! The uniforms were no better either. Loosely fitted, shabby, and heavy, and hardly adequate for any harsh climate that these soldiers were asked to march and fight in. Despite how much he stressed about good equipment in his speeches, the tenders for military supplies in Paris were always given to the cheapest bidders, and quality was never a concern. When the Grand Armée arrived in Syria after such an excruciating journey, infectious diseases ran rampant through the ranks of soldiers. It resulted in Napoleon tasting the bitter flavor of defeat for the first time at the fortress of Acre. The siege cost Napoleon 2,300 casualties, and the same number of soldiers were wounded or fell severely ill. This was a time when war medical services were worse than basic. There was little knowledge of hygiene, antibiotics weren't even invented, and medics had hardly any other option for treating wounded limbs except amputations without non-existent anesthetics. Sometimes the medics had to do a lot of amputations in a day. After a while, the saw would get blunt, making these horrible procedures last even longer. These men were really brave to not only go into battles that they may have to endure such fate and live a handicapped life. But for real, being injured on the battlefield only meant prolonged agony for the soldiers of Napoleon until demise would come due to infection. Marching with Napoleon. Napoleon led French armies in 81 battles over the entire mainland of Europe to the cold lands of Russia, the Middle East, and Africa. We have a fair idea now about why 600,000 men and more followed him to these dangerous places. And now let's explore what it was like, because Waterloo and Russia are clearly the best examples of why Napoleon's strategy and tactics weren't always the sanest decisions. But before we get to the reasons behind the fall of Napoleon, here's how living conditions were in Napoleon's military camps. Just like Queen Marie Antoinette has been immortalized with a quote she never said, Napoleon too had a quote associated with him on a similar theme that he probably never uttered. An army marches on its stomach. Of course, the Frenchman of above average height wasn't being literal, otherwise all armies would be worming around the globe today. But even if there is a shred of truth about Napoleon acknowledging the need to feed his army well, we have to call out his hypocrisy. Even though Napoleon endured the hardships of war in the 19th century with his soldiers, he didn't really make preparations for feeding this large army despite being part of it. In fact, rations were the last thing on his mind, which was mostly known for being quite single-focused in the wars. His obsession with micromanagement also hampered others from helping with such errands as well. The Grand Armée soldiers had a fixed menu for every meal on Napoleon's orders. Soup, boiled beef, a roasted joint, and some vegetables. No dessert, no beverage. Most of the cognac and sherry were employed for medicinal purposes. However, as the army was always on the move, and this was the early 19th century we're talking about, both bad roads and bad weather often prevented supply wagons from reaching campsites in time. So the Grand Armée mostly resorted to foraging off the land or plundering nearby villages, a tactic that mostly kept the army going through the Italian campaign that turned the then 27-year-old Napoleon Bonaparte into a legend. Even when Napoleon was commanding his army in a despondent situation, the lack of food was compromised with humor. Valet Louis Constant Wary wrote in his memoirs that when Napoleon's army was fighting Russians in Poland, they learned a bit of Polish. The phrase "chleba nie ma" became sort of a joke among the soldiers, which means bread, there's none. Apparently Napoleon got wind of it as well, because one day a soldier taunted him when he was passing by their camp. "Papa chleba," he yelled at the emperor. Napoleon turned and gave a wry smile with a soft reply, "Nie ma." The whole column burst into laughter. Gunpowder horse meat? Often sacrifices were made to maintain the ferocious speed at which Napoleon's army marched, and it was a key to its high success rate. A 3-day march from Alexandria to Cairo was made without water canteens, on burning sands and thick European armor, while carrying heavy armor because the time to fill canteens had to be forfeited so there wouldn't be any delay. Worse, many soldiers had thrown away their hard biscuits, hoping they would be able to forage like they did in Italy. You can't throw away your biscuits. Some passed away of thirst, others starved to their demise, and many were driven mad by heat and ended their own lives. When they reached the Nile, such was the fanaticism for their leader that Napoleon employed their anger and bitterness to inspire them to wage war instead of quenching their survival needs. Russia was worse. The cold ended more lives in the Grand Armée than the Cossacks. Starvation and temperatures at 20 below zero made the ravenous men eat horse flesh that they had to season with gunpowder. Who thinks of something like that? There's a dispute about Napoleon's diet in Russia, where he claims that Napoleon too was eating no different than ordinary soldiers. But according to French historian André Castelou, Napoleon himself enjoyed a daily repast of white bread, chambertin, beef or mutton, and rice with beans or lentils while his soldiers were dying of starvation. The real reason. Meanwhile, the demand for hashish rose exponentially among the soldiers as the bodies, carnage, and wars piled up, but Napoleon's thirst for a bigger empire saw no end. They were enjoying Arabian grass so much that Napoleon began to have a hard time keeping them in line, but they have found a better addiction than worshiping him. Now, if you've been waiting for this whole video, you're finding out the real reason why Napoleon lost? No, it wasn't the hashish, but the fact that the mirage of his charisma shattered as his hunger kept pushing the soldiers for one more battle, and he couldn't manage it all alone. Hashish was only an escape for the soldiers, who soon began deserting or finding ways to get discharged for medical reasons, and the replacements were hardly getting trained or doctrine in propaganda. By filling all the leadership positions with officers on the merit of their loyalty to Napoleon rather than actual qualification, Napoleon also surrounded himself with yes-men who were incompetent leaders. These men failed to inspire the new results or hold on to the old veterans, and Russia was a straw that broke the camel's back, making Waterloo an eventuality. Napoleon's obsession with doing everything hands-on got him immense success early, but ultimately also made things get out of hand. Thank you for watching Nutty History. I hope you learned and enjoyed it, and please share and like this video to help our cause, and subscribe for more videos like this one. I hope every single one of you have an amazing 2024.